Good evening. Thank you, Vice Mayor, members of the council, members of the staff. Thank you for your attention this evening, and thank you for this opportunity to present the task force's recommendations. The task force and the city clerk worked to create a report, a comprehensive agenda package for the public's consideration and for the council's consideration. The task force report itself is 16 pages long. It is supported by 9 exhibits, including an attachment A, which is the recommended map, attachment F, which is a task force committee report from Vice Chair Moreno and task force members Lynn, McKenzie, and Yarbrough, a 46-page outreach summary report as attachment G that reviews the community engagement's consultants' report's findings. Attachment H, which was a demonstrative exhibit that was recommended by Task Force member Yarbrough, showing certain metrics around the proposed plan. And then attachment I, which is the minutes from all of our meetings. So all of that is in the record before the council this evening. All of the written comments that we received are available for viewing on the city's redistricting website, and all task force meetings were recorded and available for viewing as well. So if we could move the slide, I'll see if my clicker works.
I moved it.
My clicker does work. All right. A little too well, apparently. Okay, here we go. So just to give you a quick overview of what the city clerk and I will be presenting this evening, I'll spend just a minute or two on the redistricting consultant selection and spend a minute or two discussing the training that we received, particularly the training with respect to the redistricting criteria. The city clerk will take us through the community engagement process, the process that we undertook prior to the release of the census data. As you know, it's a very fulsome process, and he will give a summary of that. I will briefly recap the conceptual mapping workshop, briefly review the public hearing and the deliberations, and then again briefly summarize the task force recommended plan and suggestions for the city council going forward. And then the city clerk will conclude the presentation by talking about next steps for the city council on the plan adoption. And of course, we're available for questions from the council, and the consultants are here as well. So with respect to the first topic, on March 25th, the City Council circulated an RFP for professional redistricting consultant services. The city received 3 responses: Redistricting Partners, Bear Demographics, and National Demographics Corporation. On May 5th, the task force interviewed all 3 applicants and ultimately voted to recommend NDC. On May 24th, the City Council approved the contract for NDC services. The key team members are, of course, Kristen Park, Doug Johnson, and David Ely, who's with us here this evening. And they're, of course, available to answer questions if the council has questions about the technical aspects of the plan. Early on, task force members also received training on the legal requirements for redistricting. We received great briefings from the city attorney's office and also from MDC. And page 6 of our report details the legal parameters that are considered when considering boundary adjustments to council districts. And we've summarized them here on the slide. Federal law being the first requirements, California law, including the importance of compliance with minimizing division of neighborhoods and communities of interest, maintaining compactness, and the information that's relied upon is, of course, census data, federal and state law, Fair Maps Act, public testimony, American Community Survey data, and California statewide database. So the first 2 criteria are federal, and then the second criteria is state law. In addition, other goals and considerations can include minimizing changes on election cycles, respecting voters' choices, preserving cores of existing districts. The input that we received from the City Council pertained to preserving the core of existing districts, maintaining a connection to Colorado Boulevard, minimizing the delay of voters slated for participating in the 2022 election. And really the task force's number 1 goal through this whole process was to facilitate a redistricting process that was transparent and inclusive of the diverse communities of interest here in Pasadena. So that's a quick overview of the selection of the consultant and the trainings that we received. And throughout the course of our meetings, we received reminders and were frequently able to get questions answered by the city attorney on the requirements. As you can see from Mr. Jomsky's presentation, we wanted to really take advantage of the time that we had. Since we had to wait for the census data to come out, we didn't want to not use that time. The public outreach process, we think, was very fulsome. We're very proud that over 400 people participated in that process up through and including the public hearing. And many thanks to Mr. Jomsky and his team for pulling that together. So the census data was released on August. It's somewhat obscured by my picture here, but August 12th. When it was released, there was a lot of community interest in that. And ultimately, the task force had 2 meetings where we discussed the census data. You'll recall that we couldn't move forward with mapping until after the state of California put its own gloss on the data and then presented it to us during September. And so we took a considerable testimony about the census data, and it became apparent to members of the community and to task force members that there had been an undercount. I think it's been widely reported. Obviously, there were issues around the census in the last cycle. There was an undercount. I think there was consensus in our community that the folks that suffered that undercount were people in Northwest, and that was a reality going into the mapping process that the task force members of the public were keenly aware of. So when the final redistricting population data was released, at that point, only at that point, could we begin the formal mapping process. But before the release of the information, in addition to the community workshops, we also took lots of testimony and encouraged public participation around what are the communities of interest in Pasadena. And we heard from a variety of diverse communities of interest, long-standing communities of interest, relatively new communities of interest, and even leading up to the final map information. We had a considerable amount of public testimony and public comment testimony regarding communities of interest. So we really began that process resting upon a firm foundation of a robust public participation. So this slide recaps. On August 12th, the preliminary information was released on August 19th. We had our first public hearing on community interest testimony and input, an initial discussion of census data issues. On September 18th, the vice chair and I decided to have a special meeting to focus in on further community of interest testimony and input, to get input from NDC and city staff regarding the census undercount. And that was an important community discussion. So by the time the data was finally released on September 21st and we could open our public hearing, we had had that robust discussion. And as the slide reiterates, the undercount was an important factor that informed the task force's deliberations and recommended plan. And we have citations to the report, the various pages where we discuss that. You'll see that comes up over and over again. We had a series of meetings in October. We met every Saturday morning. And our first meeting in October was a map drafting workshop. Again, every meeting began with receiving community input and testimony. At that meeting, the task force gave direction to the consultants to prepare conceptual plans for further public hearing. The task force asked the consultant to model minimal change options with various standard deviations, as well as downtown district options. The task force also gave direction to the consultant to look at maps that did and did not cross Colorado. We had further hearings on October 9th. Conceptual maps were provided by the consultant, and ultimately the task force decided to appoint an ad hoc committee to do a deeper dive into some of the conceptual plans to study the impacts of Northwest Pasadena. That ad hoc committee report is in the record as an attachment. They met separately with the consultant and then came back to the task force with a further report and further discussion. And so the task force on the 16th took additional testimony, looked at additional downtown options, and ultimately at that meeting took its first vote to begin narrowing focus. And at that time, the task force gave direction to focus on the minimal change with a 10% deviation. The October 23rd task force meeting started again with community input and testimony There was a robust discussion of various modifications to the minimal change deviation. Ultimately, no modifications were made. The task force did vote unanimously to recommend that the City Council begin the community discussion regarding anticipated changes earlier and well in advance of the next redistricting task force. If you look at page 15, we have a discussion of that issue. It was clear, not only due to the undercount, but due to upcoming changes in population, that in the next redistricting cycle, the city will face an even bigger change, potentially. And that the task force believed that it would be important for this council leading into that, not to wait 10 years, but to start that conversation in the community earlier. Task force member, former council member Margaret McGostin made that recommendation, which was unanimously adopted and is detailed in the report. Our thinking as a task force was that there should be time for this council to consider possible significant changes. The 710 stub acquisition, the completion of the Parsons project, impacts of state housing legislation. All of these things could very well factor into the next redistricting cycle, which is why we made the recommendation for the council's consideration. At our final formal meeting, we heard additional community input, received additional testimony. Ultimately, the hearing was closed, and the task force recommended the 10% deviation plan on an 11-to-1 vote. Ultimately, the task force's thinking was that we wanted to select a plan. We had gone through many months of community feedback, many months of communities of interest testimony. I had looked at various options which could have created a downtown district, and ultimately decided that the impacts on long-standing communities of interest were such that we wanted to select a plan for the council's consideration that would minimize the impacts to long-time residents and communities of interest. And also 10% deviation was recommended to mitigate some of the impacts of the apparent 2020 census undercount in Northwest Pasadena. After discussing that and reaching consensus on that, an 11-to-1 vote, task force member Marshall McKenzie recommended to the council that the council do some community outreach. Ultimately, when the council does act to approve a newly adopted map, that there be community meetings, passing youth focus, direct mailers, and various means of informing residents of the changes, and to develop additional educational materials on the importance of census participation and the results of the redistricting cycle that will occur in 2030, and how to use mapping software and provide key terms and information. So this is detailed in pages 13 to 14 of our report. So with this recommended plan, we also are recommending that the council engage in a community outreach effort, and again, begin planning early for the next cycle when we anticipate that even greater changes will come to pass. One of the attachments that I referenced, Task Force Member Yarbrough, had an excellent suggestion that was unanimously adopted by the task force to include in the materials before the council this attachment H, the metrics as to why the 10%. Staff was able to put this together in accordance with Task Force Member Yarbrough's recommendation, and we put it on the screen just by way of a demonstrative for people to consider as they're reviewing the report and the materials. So the actual recommended plan was, of course, using a counterclockwise rotation with some minimal changes of population being given up. And ultimately, as set forth in the report and as set forth on the slide, the main factors are the one person, one vote, Voting Act compliance, contiguity, communities of interest, compactness, continuity of representation, recognizable boundaries, and the tradition of districts connecting with Colorado Boulevard. These are detailed in our report at pages 3 and 4, and these were ultimately the main, I would say, factors in the recommended plan. So the actual current council districts, which are well known to the council, are here on the screen, and you compare those to the recommended council districts with a minimal change map with a 10% deviation. And again, Mr. Ely is here to answer questions. The consultants are available to answer questions about technical aspects of it. Now, if the miracle of modern technology works, I should be able to click it, and we'll have one area where we're shifting 1,625 residents from District 6 to District 7. This is a detail of that. Del Mar on north, Los Robles on west, California on south, Madison on east. And there is in attachment A, the demographic breakdown of this change. Before we take any questions, if the Vice Mayor will indulge me, we wanted to make a few thank yous. It takes a village to run a community process like this. And so the city clerk and I met and conferred, and there's some very important people we'd like to thank. Ruben Martinez, Sandra Robles, Alba Ireda, Valerie Flores, and Liliana Novella, and Latasha Reese from the city clerk's office. Thank you so much for your support. The city attorney staff, thank you to Teresa Fuentes for all of your support. And also to Arnold Lee, who also jumped in and helped us as well. The Department of Information and Technology staff was outstanding. Jade Chang and Chris Willits. They provided primary support for hybrid and virtual meetings, which really allowed this process to work well through our COVID-19 protocols. The Pasadena media staff, they were rock stars. Charles Winters, Danny Hess, Kevin Bruce, Chris Miller, and Bobby Ferguson. They provided community meeting audio and video, meeting AV support in October. They posted and made public all of the videos on KPAS and Pasadena Media, and we did get a lot of participation and hits on those media outlets. Translations for All, Lucy and Alex, thank you so much for everything you've done in providing language interpretation. National demographics, of course, Doug and Kristen and David, thank you for all your help and your expertise. They were instrumental in this process. Allegra Consulting, Suzanne Madison, Brenda Morales and the Allegra team were outstanding. Trippy Smith Consulting, writer Todd Smith, and Allison Torres, who was really the point person on working on this comprehensive 46-page report. And of course, the vice chair and members of the task force and community members that participated in the process. It really was a group effort. Last but not least, of course, we have to thank and acknowledge our city clerk, Mark Jomstein. He deserves a round of applause. He has been tireless in supporting the work of the task force. He's been 100% committed to a transparent and inclusive process. We're here in large measure because of his work. He's really one of the finest public servants I've ever worked with.
Thanks.
So I'm grateful for you. You know, the task force, it was mentioned at the end of our last meeting that what we call the Pasadena Way. And we're really a city of dedicated volunteers and dedicated public servants. And we're always guided by our collective effort to try to uplift our diverse communities in every part of our city. And I think the Pasadena Way is marked by another important quality, and that's civility. And the members of the task force and members of the public, we got together, we talked, we disagreed, but we disagreed without being disagreeable. And it was just a pleasure for me to sit at those meetings and listen to that and participate in that process. It was a great example of the Pasadena Way, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve. So thank you for that. We are available for questions. All the difficult questions go to Mr. Ealer. Thank you very much.
And Vice Mayor, if I just could, the chair has been wonderful to work with, the task force itself and the vice chair as well. But Vince and I spent many hours on the phone talking and working through issues as they came up and trying to get things, under a very compressed and challenging timeline to completion and to bring it to you here before you today is no small feat on the part of the chair, and he deserves a round of applause himself. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Farhat and Vice Chair Moreno and Mark for your work. Obviously, critically important work. Unfortunate that the census data came out late, and we were also operating under COVID rules. And I appreciate the extra work and outreach you did to make sure the community was heard in this process, given those constraints.